Welcome again to our KuK Tuesdays on the issue of dislocations. So today we're going to discuss dislocation and contact zones with a very special configuration. Me as a curator and with these beautiful and knowledgeable guests. Just to introduce the session, last year I was reading this book. Sorry. So I was reading Bell Hooks' Killing Rage, Ending with Racism. The book was published in 1985, and I was reading it as a part of my personal readings. Not only because I connect with Bell Hooks' stuff, but also because I really enjoy how she writes. In fact, in the book, she justifies the use of a simplified and non-academic language by the will to make accessible the complex dynamics of gender, race, class, and sexuality. And that's exactly why I was reading it, because as of all her other books, it was easily accessible. So I was reading it because it was enjoyable and I could exit the heavily codified readings that constitute my daily. So everything was going quite smoothly until the page 43 in the chapter 3 entitled Representations of Whiteness in Black Imagination, where she quotes James Clifford's early work on travel and theory. That's the link. My honest reaction was, oh, Clifford, here again. And I decided to read and understand her points on Clifford's idea on politics of movements and journeys. And on the following page, Hooks acknowledges Clifford's efforts to include, to quote her, different populations, classes, and genders in his attempt to set guidelines for theories on travel and the various types of materials that could result from them. However, Hooks points out two weaknesses in Clifford's consideration on travel. The first is what she called the risk of always considering journeys through a conventional lens. And what Hooks means by that is the idea of always thinking things vis-a-vis a powerful center, and by doing so reproducing imperialism and dominance schemes. The example here are immigration, migration, and relocations. And I assume we couldn't make it more contemporary given the instrumentalization of this vocabulary in current political debates. The second and the most important point Hooks raised is the violence inherent to journeys whenever we are talking about conventional or unconventional ones. Driving from her own experience of growing up in the segregated South of the United States to the predominantly white university, Hooks demonstrates clearly that theorizing on travel couldn't be relevant without considering the violence of it. So, again, in her words, listening to Clifford playfully evoke a sense of travel, I felt such an evocation will always make it difficult for there to be a recognition of an experience of travel that is not about play, but is an encounter with terrorism. So this was nearly 10 years before the publication of Clifford's influential essay, Museum as Contact Zone, Future in his book, Roots, Travel and Translation in the late 20th century. In this regard, Hooks warned us on the theoretical limits induced by neglecting violence in thinking about travel and contact in centers of domination. No later than last week, on the Marianne's kind recommendation, I was reading the introduction of the recently published book of Bruno Brulon-Suarez, Anti-Colonial Museum, Reclaiming Our Colonial Heritage, where after empirical observations, instead of talking about museum as contact zones, he chooses the expression museum as conflict zones. Little proof that nearly 40 years later, attempts of dissolving violence and its structural consequences are still causing frictions. Therefore, how can we define contact zone, the object of our meeting? Before museum has contact zone, there was Art of the Contact Zone, an essay written by linguist Louise Pratt in 1992. And working on the drawings from the Indian region during the Spanish invasion, she defines the contact zone as a space of imperial encounters, the space in which people geographically and historically separated come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relations, usually involving conditions of radical inequality and intractable conflict. So, from linguistic to representation issues, Pratt acknowledges clashes as a characteristic of the contact in her early attempt to theorize on the contact zone. At the time, she also determined other fundamental aspects, such as historical ties among the groups getting into contact, as well as its configuration, which is by essence asymmetrical. Sorry. So, in his understanding of museum as contact zones, Clifford reiterated the structural configuration highlighted by Pratt and formally pointed by Hooks as insufficient. What is interesting here, in my opinion, is the fact that the author uses the concept as an exploration and observation tool. The case he observed at times was the curation of an exhibition at the Portland Museum involving native communities, and according to his descriptions, despite this center-periphery structure, the situation could neither be reduced to a collecting process by museum's curators, nor a mere consultation. And this is important to underline in the regard of recent applications of the contact zones in Western museums. And I am sure and confident in the fact that our dear guests will extensively come back on the limits and the alternatives of this concept, which now even holds a seemingly incomplete Wikipedia page, as you can see on the slide.
So, just to hand my oops.
Yeah.
Lastly, as well, following the Cameroonian dancer
Dancer and performer Zora Snake, I attended two of the performances he gave in Berlin. I saw his piece called Opéra Villageois, the countryman's opera, presented at the Humboldt Forum, and Exotica on the brown history of European dance with the Mexican choreographer Amanda Pina at the Tanz im August Festival. Oh, these German classes. I regret he couldn't come here to talk about his work. He's so busy, but his work is appealing because it stresses important aspects of what the contacts do to the subjugated body by showing exactly how museums engage with those. So from the opening act on the first slide, on the first image, so from the opening act of the Countryman's opera to the closing, he exposes the violence of encounters from colonial times to the current European neoliberal appetites for African resources without Africans. And all of that at the Humboldt Forum, moving from the African galleries to the main hall, in row is the last image, and a place well known for questionable scientific and curatorial choices. So this type of carte blanche is calling upon the role of the contemporary art practice, the role that contemporary art practice, might play when collaborative mediation has proven to be inefficient. Addressing systematic exclusion with emotions, there remain the same governmentality risks of the contact zone, you will say, but the question is open. Finally, these collaborative practices have been established in countries influenced by English-speaking academia at the end of the 90s and have slowly spread around the world. Recently, under scrutiny, scholarship evaluated, criticized, and pointed out several incompatibilities and gaps, first between the theory and the practice, nothing special, you will say, and secondly, from the practice, some important gray zones in the theory, and this is where I stop. And
I give the stage to our guests that are way more experienced and far more knowledgeable than I on the issue. So first, you have Nami on that term. And then just to introduce her, to make it quite quick because her resume is long.
She's Doctor of Anthropology and Zoology from Université de La Rochelle and École du Louvre in France. She defended a PhD 4 years ago in 2021 on the topic of circulations and values of art from South Sea Islands in public and private collections from 1980 to 2022. 20. And she was awarded the fellowship of the LABEX Création Art Patrimoine for a residency at the Musée National Picasso in Paris. And in 2022, she was selected as part of the French National Institute of History of Art INHA Lab residency. She is author of numerous articles and publications on the KuK heritage and counts as one of the French national experts on heritage issues in post-colonial times. And beside her teaching positions at École du Louvre, Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne, and at Université de La Rochelle, Marion is also committed to foster networks among scholarship. That's why she has a long history of personal and institutional positions. For instance, now she's the co-vice chair of the International Committee for Museology and a contributor to the cabinet atypique de la Société des Océanophiles Amateurs de Rocambolesque. I couldn't translate that. That's very specific, so I give the floor to Marion.
Thank you, Joel, for the introduction, and thank you so much again for the invitation to speak about the contact zone today with you all. Actually, the contact zone was a concept that I used in my PhD that I defended 4 years ago. And at this time, it was a very fashion concept in French-speaking museology, despite the essay has never been translated into French, and I think it's not the case in German as well, neither. Yeah, so maybe it's something that we could also talk about, the idea of translation or no translation and how it also has impact on the critical aspect of the concept. So today I will critically rethink my own use of the concept a few years ago, but also add some perspectives of Clifford's concept and how it was used also by different authors. Doing so, I will base myself on 2 case studies concerning the KuK heritage, specifically the scattered KuK heritage. The first one will be a temporary exhibition called De Jade et de Nacre of seashells and nacre and nephrite for jade. And the second one is a project about other temporary returns of the KuK scattered heritage in New Caledonia. Before I go further, I would like also to add a precision on the New Caledonia, which is still an archipelago which is still under French rule until now, with a very political struggle and racism really rooted in the society.
So, to prepare this conference and this talk, I went back to Clifford's definition of the contact zone, and something that really interested me at the time of my PhD, but that really interests me today also, is that Clifford does not talk about the museum in itself, but he defined the museum through the collection, which is really something interesting concerning how he defined a museum and how he defined also, which also relates with the idea of heritage rooted in European concept. In my PhD and until now, I really studied the collection of the KuK scattered heritage, which are preserved in international museums. And
those collections have actually been inventoried since the late 70s after a claim from KuK communities to know where and how these objects were preserved. In 1990, an exhibition was organized in Nouméa in the Musée National de Nouvelle-Calédonie with the aim that some objects from European collections could be returned to New Caledonia. The exhibition was curated by Roger Boulet, a French museum professional, and Emmanuel Casarero, who was the first KuK curator for the Musée Nouvelle-Calédonie at the time.
This exhibition actually was not in itself a contact zone, as it was created only by two museum professionals. At some events and
space-times were really interesting to study as examples of contact zone. The first one was for the exhibition, when Emmanuel Casarero and his adjunct, whose name is Yves Béalogoni, went around the archipelago to meet with the KuK elders and authorities to explain them that the objects were about to come back to the islands, but that they were not supposed to stay in the island and that they will go back after. Even though some objects actually are remained in New Caledonia since this time and are still exhibited in the Musée Nouvelle-Calédonie.
During these meetings, I don't have any photographs of this, so I just show you how this the different gets.
Maybe you should use.
Okay. Just to show you how it was actually a very European traditional display of objects. I'm really contact zone. So during the meetings with KuK elders,
objects were absent, as at this time they were not in New Caledonia yet, but at the same time they were really very present and in words, in discussions, in all the dialogues that the curators had with the elders. So for me, it can also be considered as a contact zone outside the museum, something that I know Billy will address a little bit just after. Plus, Emmanuel Casarero and Yves Béalogoni were also very interesting figures to study. Back to Pratt definition, they can be considered as translators between two words, as they are both from they both were born from a KuK father and a French mother, which means that they are between the two words, the museum word and the KuK word. The second time I would like to focus on, again, I don't have any photographs of this, is a ceremony which was organized at the opening of the exhibition to welcome the objects which came back home. This ceremony was organized in the museum garden with the KuK communities and authorities met by Emmanuel Casarero and Yves Béalogoni previously. Who organized a ceremony with exchanges of words and some gifts between gifts that were given to the museum and the curators of the exhibition. During this ceremony, again, the objects were not really present as they were inside the museum and on display, but they were present in speeches mentioning the objects on display, the KaNak communities today, and KaNak ancestors, which were also made present through this ceremony. Something that
Really, again, Clifford, thinking again about this ceremony, I really thought that something was never addressed during by all the critics and comments of the contact zone.
It's the way how contact zone is not only with subjects and humans present in around the collections or in the contact zone, but how different temporalities also can encounter in this contact zone, especially the ancestors and other invisible entities that also can be brought inside this specific space, which is something actually implicit in the incipit of Clifford's text when he talk about the myth and the songs sung in the museum storages. It also, I think, invite us to focus to other agencies, not only human but also non-humans, considering this contact zone. This is one of the objects that were part of the exhibition. It is called a currency through the French through the normative taxonomies. And those objects are still made by KaNak communities, and they were part of the objects that were exchanged during the opening ceremony. I go quickly to the second case study, which continue the idea of return of objects and the idea of a relationship between KaNak communities, ancestors, and KaNak objects preserved outside the museum, with a big project that were organized in the Centre Culturel Chibaou, a big cultural center opened in 1998, with the aim to promote KaNak cultures, arts, and tangible and intangible KaNak heritage. One room was dedicated to the temporary returns of KaNak objects. This is the one of the top left pictures. And this room was called Buenado, a word in the Chemui language from New Caledonia, which means the traditional meeting. Actually, these traditional meetings are the kind of ceremonies organized during the exhibition de Jade de Nacre, which brings together KaNak communities to build relationships through different temporalities with exchange of words and objects. This project, called Object as Ambassador, was very successful. It brought in New Caledonia 73 objects on loans with 3 rotations during between 3 and 7 years. But despite this success, I would like to finish with the limits of the projects and the idea of conflict zone, as this project was only temporary, with temporary returns of objects that went back after to the museum which preserved them. And with temporary returns, this project was also temporary, as it ended in 2014 because of logistical and financial issues after French government cuts on the funds of the Centre Culturel Chibaou. when I went to New Caledonia, I still felt anger and nostalgia after the end of the project. Plus, there is still center periphery geography that is part of those projects that were organized in Noumea, the main city in New Caledonia, which is a very colonial city until now. In a big cultural center, run as a big institution, and which reproduce European norms for curation and display, as was shown in the picture. So I would like to conclude with some ideas of creating also a conflict zone to also go beyond these norms and maybe create some really real contact zone which gives spaces to friction, to negotiation, and not only really reproduction of colonial power, to also rethink museum in this process. Thank you.
So, thank you, Marion. We go straight to Billy's full presentation. So, we're just going to introduce you quickly. And he's a Caribbean-born and Berlin-based
Curator and writer. He works at Savvy Contemporary, the laboratory of form ideas. And this idea of the laboratory prison in the name of the institution he exercises is very important, I heard, in Billy's approach on curation. So in fact, he aims to rethink the materiality, meaning the forms and the format, in the common idea of exhibitions. He was a tutor at the Dutch Art Institute from 2021 to 2023, that's 2 years ago, and where he explored several topics such as agropoetics and aesthetics of sovereignty. In 2023, he was a member of the Amsterdam's The Appel Art Center curatorial program. And the same year, he was also appointed a member of the selection committee of the Future Generation Art Prize. And I seriously don't know how he survived 2023, because the same year, he also completed with his colleague Naima Hassan a residency at the Yinka Shonibare Foundation to work on archives of the infamous FESMAN, Festival Mondial des Arts Nègres, Dakar 66, and FESTAC, World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture, Lagos 1770. And some of his exhibitions projects include Monumental Shadows, It Go Have to Adjust, on language as parasite, What I Go Left Stone, on the perpetuity of Akara, the oceans. And I'm very grateful that he agreed to share his views on our topic today.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Joel. I'm very happy to be here today and be able to share the space with all of you. I mean, particularly a topic like this one, which, as you pointed out, has been very fashionable in the art world. But I think it's worth revisiting, and it's worth rethinking in a certain way. I'm also very happy to be in this space. I just wanted to mention, because when I was still at university, we didn't have spaces like this, cozy spaces. So thank you for also providing the space for us. When I was planning, when I was looking at this conversation, I was very much interested in the tension and the friction, which Marion, you mentioned in your presentation, that one finds within the concept of like the contact zones. And there's a lot of scholarship that has been done, that has been written around this concept, but I felt like, my kind of like personal approach to this would probably have to do with, a bit more of like contemporary art, because that is really the field in which I operate. It's really the field in which I work. And this said, I, decided to kind of like come in with like two examples, like two case studies, which I, would like to use to address this topic. The first one being an exhibition which I recently co-curated in Cameroon, and the reason why I wanted to bring this is because somehow I also wanted to like think about contact zones from a geographical context, which is kind of closer to like the source communities. And the second example I'm going to bring in is like a curatorial format we've been developing at Savi for quite some time now, which is called the invocations. I'm going to be looking at my notes sometimes because I tend to ramble a lot, just to make sure I don't go off track. So bear with me. Yeah, to start the presentation, as I mentioned, I was really interested in, among many other essays and like, articles that have been written about contact zones, this particular one by Johanna Lokstrup, might be butchering the name. But I think what was very interesting for me was actually the second part, which is museums as conflict zones. And I think one of the reasons why, of course, it was very appealing for me was, in the conversation we were having, Joel, before we came for this conversation, I was kind of pointing out that museum spaces still remain a kind of like, I wouldn't say alien space to some of us, but it's like some have a very difficult relationship to the museum as an institution. So some of the things, which again she points out in this article that really spoke to me was, as I mentioned over there, like the fact that in the term museum, for instance, conflict is definitely inherited, and this has to do with the fact that within the museum as a hegemonic structure, this hegemony brings in like asymmetries, but also brings in this like imbalance, this like power asymmetry, which in its own already kind of like defines the relationships under which, every interaction happens in the museum. Um, Think about the museum, I think I really think about, or I speak about the museum as something which is of a Western construct, So I really think about the museum, and when I say Western construct, not necessarily within like the West, because as my example is going to prove, there are some complexities when dealing with, like museums, again, as hegemonic structures, even within other geographies, as was the case. And I will, like elaborate on that when I speak about the example in Cameroon. But also something, which I really wanted to bring in and which I wanted to mention, because the whole idea of contact zones is again about like this, meetings, encounters, as the fact that perhaps, as Joanna writes in her essay, the meeting place is just not the right place. Which means maybe the museum as a meeting place is not just the right place, and there's a need, to rethink and like somehow renegotiate like where we actually want, these meetings and these encounters to happen. Um,
And this said, I kind of like, wrote down, I think, a few questions which stick to me, which I want to be stick to a lot of us, and which I felt like I would really want to like put up for,
hopefully, us to be able to elaborate on them a bit more. And I came up with this, like three questions, which are how relevant are ethnographic museums or any other ones, with collections, nowadays. Um, I don't have them over here. And also, I think just like to touch on the example you mentioned, Joel, you showed actually for, with the performance that happened at the Humboldt Forum, despite all this, like, decolonial, in quotes, approaches, happening in the spaces, how, welcoming, because that's a term that speaks to me a lot, but also speaks to a lot of like my colleagues, that how welcoming are these spaces to some of these like practices and approaches, which some people embody, given the fact that at the very conception and inception of the museum, this wasn't taken into consideration. And this said, again, these are some of the questions I really ask myself. It's like, okay, how can we afford ourselves, perhaps to elaborate, but also conceive other spaces, as I mentioned earlier, that can host some of these conversations we want to have. Um, and before I touch on those, on these questions, or at least try to like, touch a bit on it, I wanted to mention or like bring in, like I mentioned, the example of this exhibition, which I recently co-curated in Cameroon. The title of the exhibition yeah. It's edited before I enregistré Cameroon. So this is an exhibition which is currently ongoing at the National Museum of Yaoundé in Cameroon. It's an exhibition that was co-curated by myself and two other colleagues of mine, Chantal Edier and Yvon Lange. It's a project that was conceived and that involved German partners, German institutions, but also Cameroonian institutions. And the reason why I wanted to bring in this example, as I mentioned, returning to the idea of like the contact zone, is it is a project that involved the return of, Cameroonian cultural heritage, Cameroonian material culture, or like what I call, subject objects in a certain way, because I feel like using the term object sometimes is very limiting also, to what, some of this like cultural heritage actually involves. But similar, to the example you gave, Marion, what was, I think, interesting but also disturbing in this context was that there was a total of like 15, of this, like I say, subject objects return, but it was only on a temporary basis. So right now they are in Yaoundé, they're in Cameroon, but it's really on the idea that by February, when the exhibition is coming to an end, they're going to be returned to Germany, because most of the, let's just use the term objects, so, just to not elaborate more on it, are from different museums such as the Mark in Hamburg, but also the Linden Museum in Stuttgart. One thing that I think was very particular in working on this project, which I also wanted to bring forward in terms of like contact zones, is I was really interested in how one can approach, working in a context which is close to the source communities. How can one approach this idea of like re-encountering this cultural heritage from the space of fragmentation? And what I mean by fragmentation is the fact that with the dislocation of this cultural heritage, there are just like fragments that result from it. So how does one approach getting into contact, with them, with a particular context? And I feel like one thing that was very important for us as the curators was that we really wanted to invite, contemporary artists, contemporary perspectives on how we can recontextualize, returning cultural heritage. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think the reason why I also wanted to bring this example is just to maybe somehow slightly highlight the fact that beyond, the kind of like disturbing and like difficult context of like contact zones within the West, I think one thing that kind of like complicates it even more is like the hegemony which I mentioned. So again, the hegemony which we faced within the museum, the National Museum in Cameroon, made it even more difficult, in a certain way to be able to work around this. And I brought, just a very few images just to mention that the project was really all about inviting contemporary art, contemporary perspective in, recontextualizing some of this. But one thing we also did was like an incredible amount, of work around cartography, which, somehow also upon the topic of this shared colonial heritage between Germany and Cameroon. And these are just some of the images, of like the contemporary artworks. But I also brought these two particular images because there is an anecdote to this, particular slide. I think I can point over. Yeah, exactly. So the image you see over here, this one in particular is, one of the returning objects, that arrived in Cameroon, and this is a tangue, which is, the symbol of mostly like the Douala, like coastal area. This was one of the objects, for instance, that returned from the Mark Museum in Hamburg. But one thing that was interesting was, again, in the idea that they were returning these objects to Cameroon, some of the difficulties we faced, well, which is very common to like the restitution debate, was all about how can they efficiently preserve, and I really say preserve because you can perhaps identify on this other image, these are, I would say, objects that are probably of the same era as these ones, but the only difference is that we got these ones from a king who is the king of Boneko in the coastal region in Cameroon too. And one thing that was very interesting when we had like lengthy conversations with him, we also invited him to kind of like speak a bit more museum practices and this idea of like museums almost having this entitlement when it comes to I wouldn't say dictating, but like, telling us and like informing source communities and how best they can take care of like their material, like cultural heritage. And one thing that was interesting for him and which he really insisted on was the fact that there is no need to like put, whatever he's like lending behind these showcases. So I think in bringing this image, what I really wanted to show is how, in this idea of like re-encountering this material heritage, the hegemony or like the top to bottom ideas ideologies that are found within institutions like museums can actually influence how we come into contact with this. Yeah, like I said, I ramble a lot, so I need to look at my notes. Yeah, exactly. But also I think one thing that again was very interesting in the approach we had with the king. When we invite him to speak about again issues on restitution, there is one thing he mentioned which I found very fascinating and which I actually totally agree with. It's the fact that he said. There's a tendency where the museum is in the idea of preservation and of longevity. His approach to some of this material heritage is that some of it actually allows men to last that long. Some of them are meant to perish. Some of them are meant to decay. Some of them are meant to be destroyed, which again I thought was very interesting, within the space of this exhibition we're working on to have on one side objects, for which the approach is a bit more, okay, we need to understand they also have their own agency, they age over time, they can perish. And the ones returning from Germany where there were all these like, sanctions and like all these impositions from German institutions in terms of like how best Cameroonians were meant to take care of their own cultural heritage. Yeah, and maybe just to get on the second example and somehow just close over there, because like I said, I think I'm really interested in also hearing more like your perspectives on some of the questions I brought up. Of course, working in a space like Sabi Contemporary, which might be known to some but might be known, to others. There's also this like constant I think question, but also point that is raised up by people, who come over to the space. Does Savvy act as a contact zone? And somehow, I think it does, but I also think it doesn't necessarily try to define itself as a contact zone. I think that's something that's very important to mention. But perhaps I can also just read one of the I think one of the multiple definitions one can assign to Savvy, which was written by the founder of Savvy, who's Bonaventure Ndikung, who's currently the director of the Haus der Kultur and der Welt. And it's in an essay he wrote in 2021 where he actually said, Savvy Contemporary is not envisioned as a site of harmonious coexistence. Rather, it seeks to reframe and question well-known exhibition formats in ways that actively contribute to the creation of contact and conflict zones where friction-filled pluralization processes play themselves out. And I think there's something for me very interesting in this definition. There's something very appealing to it, which led me, to questioning not only the spaces in which we want to have these conversations and these encounters again, but also how do we develop new methods? What are the concepts? What are the vocabularies that we create? And I think in the idea of contact zones, as Louise, Mary Pratt wrote in her essay, language also plays a very important role. And this said, and maybe just to finish on this, I think that is where the concept and the idea of the invocation again, which was defined, which was coined and like defined, by Bonaventure Ndikung is very interesting in the sense that it has turned out to be a public program which we host in Berlin, which we host, at our space, and it has to do with everything from invoking, material and immaterial, spirits, but also, beings into the space, through poetry, through performance, through food and everything. But I think one thing that is very interesting to that, and then to touch again on this idea of like hegemony is, I think even as a space as Savvy, we understand the fact that being based in the West, being based, in the North, there's already this like power asymmetry somehow that comes into play with the source communities we're working with. And I think that's why the invocation as a format is very interesting, because it is something that takes a shape, and it's something that also advocates for our practice, within the space at Savvy to be able to move around and like meet the people within the different localities. So I think you can almost interpret it as like, rather than inviting the people to come into a space, we are moving the museum, the institution, into the different localities, acknowledging that whatever happens in that space, will be completely different to what happens, in Germany, in Berlin, and all of this, kind of like forms ways in which we try to tackle this power, asymmetries. Yeah, so I think I'm just going to stop here. But yeah, I think, like I said, I'm just very curious, to also hear from you later on. Yeah.
And then the last intervention. Thank you very much, Billy. That was very interesting. I'm looking forward to the exchange phase. So to introduce Melanie, she's a PhD student at the Sainsbury Research Unit from the University of East Anglia and the British Museum in London. So her work currently focuses on collections from Polynesia collected by the London Missionary Society that are actually hosted in the British Museum collections. So a collection that reunites more than hundreds of sacred items from Hawaii, Cook Islands, and the French Polynesia. Mililani holds 2 master's degrees, the first obtained at the Sorbonne University in France and the second at the University of Hawaii. So before receiving the British Museum Doctoral Fellowship in 2023, she taught at the University of Virginia in the United States and served as a task officer for the Vice Presidency and the Ministry of Culture of French Polynesia. Last year, she took part in the Académie des Traces, joint initiative of about 10 research institutions on issues of colonial legacies and museography. And Mililani considers herself as an archivist, sacred belief, if I'm right. And her work is deeply rooted in the orality, the incarnations, as well as the written poetics of the South Seas. And this is very much why I like reading and listening to her reflections on community knowledge making. And I very much recommend some of her interviews. She gives a lot of interviews at the French TV. Some of her interviews and presentations she did, although unfortunately in French, most of them, right? Yeah. So
Maruru met A. Thank you very much, Yorana. Everyone, hello. Thank you very much for hosting us tonight. It's actually a pleasure to be sharing that space with you. And it's actually true. I agree that I remember also in college we didn't have a lot of like safe spaces where we could actually share a lot of like thinking in progress and in process. So tonight will actually be a good opportunity to reflect on some of the work that I've been doing, and Marion and Billy actually have set the space for me to talk. I'm very much jet lagged because I've been on a 27-hour flight from the ED, so please excuse me if I'm rambling, and I have an excuse for that. So I was thinking, like, I actually also forgot my notes, but that's okay. So I was thinking that a lot have been said on the conceptual thinking and rethinking about the contact zones from 2 different perspectives are actually very complementary to my own work. And there was one word that I was actually going to use, and it's the word friction that they've been talking about. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that. What I want to be sharing is actually a couple of just reflections on the contact zone based on what Marion and what Billy have been saying. So when I think about contact zone, I actually have, from a very phenomenological perspective, I think about a place that is actually very close to my house, which people who are very familiar with Oceania will know. It's the Matavete. It's actually the place where most of the navigators and European explorers have come. And I'll actually go there to walk my dog, to go for a run. It's actually a very a place where I feel very much anchored because the ocean is nearby. I go to the water every day. But then through this dissertation, doing a PhD at the British Museum actually reminded me that, like museum can be such an expanded conceptual thinking when you think about contact zones and places. So from very philological perspective, when I think about contact zone, I think about this place. And this place is important because it has actually a lot of places of memory. There are much actually evidence of that colonial encounters that we ourselves have a very hard time reflecting upon. And in a very strange and paradoxical way, this doing dissertation on the London Literary Society collection that is housed at the British Museum helped me actually question and reflect upon these places we call home, these contact zones that we are actually inherent in our own landscapes, and in a very weird way. So this is on the left. It's a memorial. It's a memorial that is actually dedicated to the arrival of the London Literary Society in Tahiti in 1797. As you can see, it's actually a quite. I mean, I'm not sure it's actually visible from the photographies, but it's a quite decayed monument. And in my mind, actually does reflect some of the aspects of the museum as a contact. So what I mean by that is that first, we think about when we think about museum as a contact zone, we think about, even though we allude to other places, we think at some sort of monolithic block that appeals to other places and locations, and we hardly think about them as a network of places that are actually linked in each other, either by colonial remnants or fragments, but also by the people who live there. So there's a sense of discrepancy between on one hand, those places that are in specific locations, and the museum as a place that is actually outside of those locations, mostly and mainly in Europe. And that's why Billy's talk was actually very interesting to me, because he raised a lot of the questions that I actually asked myself through my own dissertation. So I'll try to based on what they've been saying, what I'll try to explain today is to think and to rethink about the contact zone within the museum context, but also outside relationship to source communities. I think it's very important, although it makes sense, but it's also very important to ponder upon the notion and the power of creativity as a tool, actually to reimagine the museum, and especially from a cultural framework and context. What I think is also been interesting in terms of like readings, I tend to think with the Nicholas Thomas as a museum as method, as something that like big methodological and theoretical concepts or reframings can actually happen within the museum context, which was my case at the British Museum, where obviously it's a very conservative institution, to say the least. And also you have very, a lot of our disciplinary thinking were inherited from spaces like this one. But in a very weird and interesting way, there's a word on Clifford's book that actually speaks to me in very different, interesting ways, is the word route. Because in a way, disrupting this colonial route and not going to study in France, but to experiment and to do my work in the United Kingdom, in the British Museum, was actually very interesting to question this concept of contact zone within a very particular set of relationship and freedom to do that. And given the fact that most of the tools and methods in our own disciplines actually are very much questioned, I saw this work in this museum with this collection as a way to rethink not only just methods but also conceptual frameworks. And I do that in a very rhizomatic way, and I think that's something that was very interesting to think with in terms of the contact zone, is that although you're in a very specific place, you also think like about multi places at the time, including the locations that you think that that are very much anchored in your home places. And what I've been trying to do in relationship to certain concepts of the contact zone, such as contact languages, is to try to actually experiment with new conceptual methods that are anchored in Tahitian culture, and to use that as a way to try to conceptualize what's happening in the storage room and in a place like the British Museum. I've been very inspired to do that because I've been in touch with a lot of different people in my own community, and in particular, a generation of what we call like the first generation of Tahitian ethnographers. In the 1960s, they've been trying to collect stories based on very ritualized practices and protocols that have been taught by them. And one of them is called the tuatapapar accession, which I try to apply in a museum setting. So tuatapapar as a method is inspired by a Tahitian word, tuatapapa, to means to develop, to think broadly about that, about all kind of issues. And so it's a very, as I've said, it's a very ritualized method and protocol that involved first off to raise a question. It could be in a group of 10 people. And
what's called la parole circulates as long as people have not agreed on the issue. The question could be relevant to, was actually very much used to in the context of collecting oral stories. In this very instance, trying to question the heroic act of activity, or to talk and to elaborate more deeply on significance of one portion of a story. What I thought was very interesting is that in order to try to reimagine and to rethink museum methods, I thought about applying that method to actually work on museum collection. What actually first comes out of that is actually friction. And instead of shying away from friction, I think what comes up we seen as tensions can actually be productive ways to think more of to rethink methodological models within this context. Yeah. So this is actually two instances of doing a Tuatapapa session in two contexts. One of them is the Stoke the British Museum with the mayor of Manila, who's very involved in trying to change the not change, but to reappropriate our histories and remap the Matanipe with our old stories. And the second one was a session that I just freshly hosted at home that lasted until 3 a.m. in the morning, and basically showing community members, including navigators and linguists and people will be very involved in museum-related issues at home for a long time. Discount these photos of the collection that I'm working on. The two sessions were two different kind of reactions because it wasn't obviously the same space, but it was interesting in thinking about them not as opposite sides or as a storage room and the hoax space, but as two shares or two sides of the same coin, thinking more theoretically about what he meant. What I thought interesting with the sessions that I held at Ho is that I taught because they could only see photographies.
It was actually doing part of doing homework and not being able to bring the object, that people will have a very different relationship to the object because it was mediated by the visual aspects of it. And I was actually surprised to see that they have very strong phenomenological like reactions and perception of the object even through like photographies. So for me, this idea of like developing new curatorial and also praxis and methods of working within the collection by linking and working outside the collection with community members that do share questions and issues that were raised by a lot of the critics through the context, but that can be pushed further to elaborate new models to actually rethink that.
And in also a very interesting way, when I think they talk about the contact zone, like I kind of think, and museums more generally, I think about them as like a philosophical trope of the thesis sheet. It's like this idea of like, if there's a sheet that is being built, and if we change every plank of the same sheet, does it stay the same, or does it might be different thing?
I don't have an answer for you now, but I think it's a good philosophical trope to think about when we think about museums and trying to elaborate new curatorial framework of conceptual frameworks to think about museum collection and community engagement. Because ultimately, a lot of the answers that, a lot of the questions that we inherited from the contact zone
can also be productive methodology like frictions that can help us solve not all the issues, but help us think about museum accessibility in general.
And I think I can stop right there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your interventions. We should have like 20 minutes for like among each others. My first questions, two questions to you, given your interventions, will be first this idea of frictions. We all taught about fictions, violence, and I really like the idea, the bell hooks idea of terror. And that's because I like how she radically puts things, but giving this, like, I would say, consensus about the violence inherent to the contact zones, museums or art centers, I'm thinking savvy, are the right places to mediate violence and its structural consequences. Who would like to start?
I mean, to be very honest with you, I don't. I I I think my answer in German you say "jein," which is like yes and no. you know, um, I think there are definitely I think well, I can speak in the context of Savi, for instance. I think when we speak a lot about friction and tension, it is just acknowledging the fact that we all come in with, I don't know, different like urgencies, agents. And I think just that encounter again, creates like this tension and this friction already. And is it a step towards like answering some of these questions? I think yes, but is it the only way some of these questions can answer? I think no, And um, I feel like perhaps again, like even with the anecdote, I think maybe that's where I find it a bit disturbing.
Like museum practices, for instance, like and like museum, well, like working at, well, maybe you don't like. It feels like I'm shooting a lot at the museum, but I think it's like shooting at like hegemonic structures. But I think everything that kind of like tries to impose a particular way of like seeing and going for me, that's not an answer to any this question. And I feel like perhaps that's where Sabe is kind of interesting because at least in try, and this based on the fact that you even within the team already, you have
like all this
apologizers,
diverse,
like
like voices and everything. So like that automatically brings in different perspectives. Yeah, yeah.
Um, Maybe I can try to go on with this idea of multiple perspectives. I think it's the first step to recognize different points of view of what is violence and what is colonial past. But at the end, I'm not sure that museum really can really succeed in that. I can take the example of the Musée Nouvelle-Calédonie, which tries to rethink his permanent exhibition, I think, since 1998, something like that. And it's a big struggle within the society to define what is the colonial power. And as it is still part of, it is still here actually. So how can you define violence while it is still present? It is really something that has never found any answer for now. A project of permanent exhibition has started to be set, but considering the situation still since last May, I'm not sure that we can bring a consensus of what is the history of New Caledonia and what is the society today.
I was just thinking about something that maybe we don't mention enough when we think about violence. Apart from the structural hierarchical violence, is also the body, like the physical perception of violence in every place of the museum. And I think that in a way, I tend to think that it's hard to. I mean, obviously, with the museum practice that we have, it can't. For me, it can't. Help us grapple with that violence. But I also just think that
Even if we were to use new tools because of the nature of the rapidity and
the feeling of being in that kind of like environment, this specific type of building that is the archetypical Western ethnographic museum. It's hard to rethink that because our bodies are so used to feeling that way, and also that's where how we orientate ourselves in relationship to such spaces.
I think it will be hard to deny the fact that we're going to have to grapple with colonial violence and violence in itself within the museum structure for actually a very, very long time, except if we rethink the physicality of the space first and foremost.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for your answers. Interesting.
And maybe outside this the zoo and graphic collections perspective, and driving from your idea of implementing some creational
Community-based process in curatorial practices, and also giving your work at Savi, where would you situate the place of contemporary art practice from communities in the museum today in this mediation process? I feel like I'm asking some very triggering questions.
I mean, maybe I can. Oh yeah, another one here too. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I want to pick up on, on the point that was just made actually, because museum, like I don't know if you're referring to like the graphic museum as you mentioned, but I think for me, and it was the same with the experience I had, the exhibition I showed, that I co-curated in Cameroon. Of course, I mean, I think the National Museum in Cameroon, the way it is right now, is definitely like like a Western museum. It's like it's a museum that was conceived in the post-colonial context. And it's just a Western museum. And I feel like in trying to bring in contemporary art as the doorway through which we could recontextualize, some of this like returning cultural heritage, I felt some pushback, from the museum. But I think it's also the case, with the example you showed, for instance, about the performance that happened at the Humboldt Forum. I feel like it is almost this idea of we're happy to give you some room and some space to do whatever you want to do, but it ends there, I think that's where, the point you made to me, like it speaks to me a lot. It's like just because of the way it was conceived,
from the inception, I think the way, like, especially like formerly colonized like bodies booming, so it is completely different. So there's a kind of unease, I think, even with contemporary art that
you can't really resolve, no matter like, whether you bring contemporary art in or not. Yeah.
So maybe a little question to Marion. I noticed that you're very careful with this label decolonial in your publications and an article, and I wonder if it's like optimistic or even doable to like really implement the colonial practices in, let's, yeah, I want to skip museums, but in museums nowadays, especially when they are located in former colonial centers like Berlin, Paris, Brussels, and London, for example.
I'm not sure that museum can really succeed in decolonization. As we said, and as Melanie said, they're daily as well. Museums are rooted in colonial power. The building, the structures are still very colonial in many of these aspects, and even even if some museum practices are labeled as decolonial, more or less of the museum practices are still very inherited from the colonial power. I mean, you talked about the rules and the way collections are preserved and created. We can also talk about the words and the vocabularies used to define the collections, the databases, the inventories. We need to decolonize museums. Actually, we need to go from scratch and to destroy everything to start all over again. I'm not sure that we can decolonize a little bit of one layer, but it's just a little aspect of something. It's not all the whole structure.
And this is why you're cautious.
Yes, that's why I'm cautious.
So maybe a very last question to Billy, because as you mentioned, at the very beginning, contact zones were, I would say, theorized following linguistic studies, and the idea of, languages such as pidgins, creoles being labeled as contact languages, and I noticed that in your work you use a lot of pidgin, Cameroonian/Nigerian one, and for some artists, I think Fela Kuti, for example, they conceive pidgin not as a result or a parallel of contact zones, but as a proof of, I would say, Nigerian genius, for example, so in opposition to English. That is a colonial language. And I wonder how you perceive the use of pidgin in your work as a curator and author.
I mean, that's actually like a very interesting question, because I think, pidgin, just as Creole, as you mentioned, if there's any quality about these languages which I really appreciate, is like how much you can't really grasp them. It's like there's something, ungraspable about these languages. They're always like changing. They're always evolving. And I think, every time I return to Cameroon, I'm fascinated by how much, I get a few things, but there's certain things I don't get, and I think it's because of the fact that these are languages that are always evolving. So I think, reducing it to like broken English, as people sometimes, say about pidgin, or like broken French, as people sometimes say about Creole, it's like not even understanding, what it is about. Because I think one thing that, Fela, and that's one of the reasons why he spoke, he sang mostly in pidgin, but also,
spoke properly in pidgin, but also maybe others, like scholars about these languages. It is definitely, a tool, of the construction. What pidgin does, if
for anything, it's not only, breaking down English, it's literally like, crushing it, So I think there's something about, using pidgin within like a theoretical framework. But one thing I acknowledge in my work is that it's a language, like today I can write something in pidgin, and like in 5 years time, if I were to write the same thing, it would be completely different, and for like even as a conceptual framework, that's why pidgin, is kind of interesting. Like, there's a book,
about pigeonization as a curatorial method, which again I think really elaborates on how even the curatorial discipline as something which, as much as
curatorial studies, because graduating from a curatorial program, it was really about like, okay, these are like kind of like rules and like guidelines and everything. But I think where all these other languages like French, English, and German try to like, set guidelines or like rules on how the language is meant to be structured, pidgin does the opposite, Yeah.
Well, thank you.